Hello, and welcome to the third installment of the Musicuentos Black Box Podcast. The Musicuentos Black Box Podcast is a collection of free media resources connecting world language teachers with relevant research in language acquisition, learning, and teaching. The project is co-sponsored by Musicuentos.com and Indwelling Language. This episode is presented by me, Albert Fernandez, an elementary and middle school Spanish teacher and the blogger behind senorfernie.wordpress.com, a resource for reflection and discussion of strategies for comprehensible input methods in the lower grades. In this episode, we will be discussing Stephen Krashen's 2013 article entitled The Compelling, Not Just Interesting, Input Hypothesis. Before we can start talking about the compelling input hypothesis, we need to start with some background on the research that underpins it. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Stephen Krashen developed his 5 hypotheses, which have guided many language teachers and researchers ever since. These hypotheses have been both praised and debated by academics and classroom teachers in the 30-plus years since they were first developed, but the fact that they are still discussed today in foreign language education programs and textbooks serves as an indication of the importance and influence the hypotheses have had on foreign language teaching and second language acquisition research. The hypotheses are: 1. The acquisition learning hypothesis, which states, basically, that the acquisition of a language and the learning of a language are different. One can acquire a language and not learn it, and one can learn language without acquiring it. The second is the affective filter hypothesis, which states that how we feel will affect how well we acquire a language. If we are nervous or anxious, the affective filter is high, making it harder for us to focus on the input we are getting. On the other hand, if we are relaxed and comfortable in our acquisition setting, the affective filter is low, and we will better be able to acquire the language because we won't be so hung up on making mistakes. The third is the natural order hypothesis, which states that humans acquire a language in a certain specific order. The implication is that we should use grammar naturally in our input, regardless of how difficult it is in the traditional sense. If the input is comprehensible and interesting, the students will acquire the grammar when they are ready, and we'll discuss input in a few moments. The fourth hypothesis is the monitor hypothesis, which states that language learning, rather than acquisition, can only provide a monitor or an editor for students trying to use language and can realistically only be used in certain situations. The fifth of the original 5 hypotheses is the input hypothesis. This is one of the most important, and it has some of the most far-reaching implications for us in the classroom. This hypothesis states that we will acquire language through input that is comprehensible. In other words, if we can understand what the L2 speaker is saying in the target language, we are slowly acquiring all parts of the language, vocabulary, grammar, and everything else, whether we know it or not. As teachers, the implication of these 5 hypotheses is that we shouldn't focus on teaching grammar explicitly all the time. Instead, we should be teaching for understanding of the message we are discussing. We should use comprehensible input, which is basically communication that students can understand in the target language. This input can take many forms, whether it is a story, content from another subject area, historical information from the target culture, or even social or moral issues. In the years since developing the 5 hypotheses, Stephen Krashen has become an advocate for literacy in L1 and L2, and has become a huge advocate for free voluntary reading, or FVR. In FVR, students choose what they want to read in the target language and are allowed to read as much as they can. They will acquire more because of the inherent motivation that comes from genuinely wanting to know more about a topic of personal interest. This is the idea behind the compelling input hypothesis. The compelling input hypothesis takes the input hypothesis discussed before in a more specific direction. Whereas the input hypothesis states that input that is understandable or comprehensible is what students need to acquire language, the compelling input hypothesis takes that idea one step further by stating that for input to be truly helpful in acquisition, it needs to be more than just comprehensible. It needs to be compelling. Krashen defines compelling input as input that is, quote, so interesting you forget that it is in another language. In other words, compelling input is so engrossing that you focus completely on the meaning and ignore the fact that it is in another language. Krashen states, compelling input appears to eliminate the need for motivation, a conscious desire to improve. When you get compelling input, you acquire whether you are interested in improving or not. Unquote. What Krashen is saying here is that there doesn't need to be any kind of extra external motivation coming from the teacher. Compelling input, as the name suggests, is intrinsically motivating because the student will be so interested in the meaning that he or she will want to continue on his or her own. The acquisition of the language, rather than being the focus of instruction, is a byproduct of the input. As the input hypothesis states, comprehensible input is the main driver of language acquisition. So if the students are getting lots of input that they are interested in, and that is comprehensible, there is no need to push students to focus on language rules because they are already acquiring them through the input, and they are motivated to continue because they find it so interesting or compelling. As proof of the efficacy of the compelling input hypothesis, Dr. Krashen uses a case study of a learner of Mandarin named Daniel. Daniel had no interest in pursuing Mandarin instruction, even though he was in a heritage language learner program. The program's instructor, Dr. Lau, who wrote the original article in which the case study appears, introduced Daniel to a series of chapter books and comic books in Mandarin that Daniel ended up loving. Daniel became so deeply interested in the books that he didn't even realize they were a bit advanced for him. He didn't even realize that he was acquiring Mandarin. Krashen states, quote, Daniel's Mandarin was clearly improving, but he wasn't aware of it, nor was he particularly interested. He was only interested in the stories. The compelling input hypothesis has clear implications for foreign language teachers. The first is that we should allow students to follow their interests in reading. Students need access to materials in the target language that are compelling to them, whether they are books, magazine articles, cartoons, or comics. Because of the time and cultural constraints of the classroom, we cannot exactly replicate real-world language use, but we can try and approximate it as much as possible. As Sarah Elizabeth discussed in episode 1, commercially available textbooks usually use synthetic methods, which are methods that present students with rules and pieces of information and ask them to put them together to form language. The compelling input hypothesis is on the other end of the spectrum from this approach. We present students with a compelling input and they analyze it subconsciously for what they can acquire and acquire it as they are ready. They focus on the message, and as they read more, they build an internal system of language without actively focusing on rules and linguistic information. Now, this is a short article, but it has some major implications for our classroom instruction. The takeaway from the compelling input hypothesis is this: we can present compelling topics to students using natural and comprehensible language in our speaking and in our reading materials. By doing this, we de-emphasize the explicit teaching of grammar to our students. Rather, we help them build a mental representation of the language instead of teaching individual skills and hoping that they can put them all together on their own. In closing, to take advantage of the benefits of compelling input, we need to build up our classroom libraries with appropriate level books in the target language. We need to let students read in the target language as much as they can about the topics that they choose. Thank you so much, and keep your eyes peeled for the next installment of the Black Box Video Podcast. Let us know what you thought about the video in the comments, and if you're interested in learning more about Stephen Krashen's work, you can go to his site, www.sdkrashen.com, which has free access to a large amount of his academic work on second language acquisition. For more information, or to help keep this resource available for teachers everywhere, visit musicuentos.com/blackbox.